A humble African woman sat at the wrong table during a blind date, without knowing he was a billionaire Arab executive. What happened next will leave you speechless. Fatima had never been on a blind date before. Raised in a humble village in Senegal, she wasn't used to luxury. But today, she found herself in an extravagant restaurant, feeling completely out of place. Nervously, she scanned the room until she spotted a well-dressed man sitting alone. Assuming it was her date, she took a deep breath and approached. "Are you Omar?" she asked timidly. The man lifted his gaze, intrigued. "No," he replied, his deep voice calm. "But sit." Fatima had no idea she had just sat across from Khalid al-Rashid, one of the richest businessmen in the Middle East. And what started as a mistake would change her life forever. Before we begin, subscribe, like this video, and turn on notifications to never miss an inspiring story like this. Fatima's hands trembled slightly as she gripped the menu, her eyes scanning the lavish golden chandeliers and pristine white tablecloths. The restaurant was beyond anything she had ever imagined. Back in her small Senegalese village, meals were shared in clay bowls under the open sky, with laughter and conversation filling the air. Here, everything felt quiet, too refined, too distant. Her best friend, Awa, had arranged the blind date, insisting that Fatima needed to meet someone new. "You're too kind, too giving. You deserve someone who sees you," Awa had said. But now, sitting here in this intimidating place, she wasn't so sure. Fatima's heart pounded as she looked around, searching for her supposed date, Omar. Awa had described him as tall, well-dressed, with an elegant air. That didn't narrow it down much. Almost every man in the restaurant fit that description. Then she saw him. A man sitting alone at a corner table, dressed in a sharp, dark suit, his wrist adorned with a luxurious watch. He had an air of confidence, the kind that made people unconsciously step aside as he walked by. Taking a deep breath, she walked toward him. "Excuse me, are you Omar?" she asked timidly, her voice barely above a whisper. The man looked up, his dark brown eyes locking onto hers. There was a flicker of something in his expression, curiosity, amusement, maybe even intrigue. He tilted his head slightly before answering. "No." His voice was deep, measured. "But please, sit." Fatima hesitated, embarrassed. "Oh, I'm so sorry. I must have gotten the wrong table." She turned to leave, but his voice stopped her. "I don't mind the company," he said. Something about his tone made her pause. It wasn't an order, nor was it pity. It was genuine intrigue. Unsure of what else to do, she slowly pulled out the chair and sat across from him. I don't usually do this," she admitted, nervously adjusting the sleeve of her modest dress. "You don't usually sit at the wrong table?" he asked, an amused glint in his eyes. Fatima laughed softly, shaking her head. "No, I don't usually go on blind dates." For the first time, the man smiled. It was subtle, but it softened his sharp features. "And yet, here you are," he said, his gaze never leaving hers. She nodded, still unsure if she should stay. "I was actually supposed to meet someone named Omar. My friend set it up." "And what do you know about this Omar?" Fatima hesitated. "Not much, just that he's supposed to be kind, understanding, someone who doesn't judge." The man leaned back in his chair, studying her. "Then maybe you were meant to sit here instead." His words sent an unexpected shiver down her spine. There was something about him, something unreadable, yet deeply magnetic. She cleared her throat. "I'm Fatima." "Khalid," he said simply, extending a hand. She shook it, noticing how firm yet gentle his grip was. A waiter appeared at their table, his demeanor shifting the moment he recognized Khalid. "Mr. Al-Rashid." The waiter greeted him with a slight bow. "Your usual?" Fatima's stomach twisted. Al-Rashid? That name sounded important. Khalid nodded, then turned to her. "And for the lady?" "Oh, just water, please." The waiter nodded and left. Fatima could feel the question pressing on her tongue. Who was this man? As if sensing her curiosity, Khalid spoke. "You don't know who I am, do you?" She shook her head. "I own this restaurant," he said casually. Her eyes widened. "You own it?" "And 20 others like it," he added. "Hotels, real estate, private investments." A lump formed in her throat. She had sat at the table of a billionaire. Fatima suddenly felt small, out of place. What was she doing here, sitting across from someone so powerful? She reached for her napkin, as if ready to excuse herself, but Khalid's voice stopped her. "You don't have to go," he said. "I enjoy real conversations, not the scripted ones people have when they know who I am." She hesitated. "But I don't belong in places like this." Khalid leaned forward slightly. "And yet, you walked in." Fatima swallowed hard. His words carried weight, as if he were challenging her perception of herself. For the first time, she stopped thinking about where she came from, and started wondering where she could go. But before she could respond, a voice interrupted them. "Excuse me?" A waiter approached. "A gentleman named Omar is asking for a woman named Fatima." Her heart skipped a beat. She turned to Khalid, who simply raised an eyebrow. "You could go," he said, "or you could stay." Fatima took a shaky breath. A choice stood before her, and deep down she knew, whichever one she made, would change everything. Fatima's heart pounded in her chest as she looked between Khalid and the waiter. Omar, the man she was supposed to meet, was waiting for her. This was her chance to escape the uncomfortable tension building between her and Khalid al-Rashid, the billionaire Arab executive she had accidentally sat with. She should leave. That's what any rational person would do, but something held her in place. Khalid's dark brown eyes studied her, not with impatience or expectation, but with curiosity. He wasn't asking her to stay, nor was he urging her to go. He was simply waiting, as if testing what kind of person she was. The waiter cleared his throat. "Miss, should I let Mr. Omar know you'll be joining him?" Fatima exhaled slowly. Tell him I won't be coming." The words left her lips before she had fully processed them. She had chosen to stay. Khalid's expression remained unreadable, but there was a flicker of something in his gaze. Approval? Intrigue? She couldn't tell. The waiter nodded and left. Fatima gripped her napkin tightly, her fingers trembling slightly. "I don't know why I did that," she admitted, half laughing at her own recklessness. Khalid smirked. "Because you were curious." She let out a breath. "Maybe. Or maybe I just wanted to have a conversation that didn't feel forced." "Then let's talk," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Tell me about yourself." Fatima hesitated. What was there to tell? She wasn't from a wealthy family. She had no impressive career, no grand achievements. She was just Fatima. "I'm from a small village in Senegal," she began. I moved to the city a few years ago to find work. I help run a local bookstore. A bookstore? Khalid's eyebrows lifted slightly. That's unexpected? Why? He shrugged. Most people who come from difficult backgrounds focus on survival. They don't choose something as fragile as books. She smiled softly. Books are how I survived. Growing up, they were my escape, my way of dreaming beyond the life I had. For the first time, Khalid seemed caught off guard. His fingers tapped lightly against the table as he studied her. And what do you dream of? Fatima hesitated, embarrassed by the question. I don't know. I don't believe that, he said. Everyone dreams of something. She glanced down at her hands. I guess I dream of being seen, of not just existing, but mattering, of making a difference, even if it's small. Silence hung between them. When she finally looked up, she was surprised to see something different in Khalid's expression. Respect. I know that feeling, he admitted. Fatima frowned. You? But you're a billionaire, he finished for her. She nodded. He exhaled as if weighing his words. Power doesn't erase loneliness. Money doesn't guarantee respect. Sometimes, the more you have, the harder it is to know if you matter beyond what you can offer. She hadn't expected that answer. I imagined your life was perfect, she admitted. Khalid laughed, a short, bitter sound. There's no such thing as a perfect life, only lives that look perfect from a distance. Fatima fell silent, digesting his words. Before she could respond, the waiter returned with their orders. Khalid's dish was extravagant. Succulent lamb over saffron rice, drizzled with a golden sauce. Fatima's stomach twisted. She hadn't even ordered anything. Would you like to eat? Khalid asked, noticing her hesitation. She stopped herself. She wasn't used to expensive meals. A simple plate of rice and vegetables was more than enough for her daily needs. Khalid, however, didn't wait for an answer. He called the waiter back. Bring another plate, he ordered. The waiter bowed and left. You didn't have to do that, she said. I wanted to, Khalid replied simply. The way he said it, so casually, made her realize something. He wasn't showing off. He wasn't expecting anything in return. He had simply chosen to share a meal with her. For a moment, she let herself relax. They talked as they ate. About books, about travel, about dreams that neither of them had spoken aloud before. Fatima found herself forgetting who he was, forgetting her nerves, until a voice shattered the moment. So this is where you've been hiding. Fatima turned to see a man approaching their table, tall, lean, dressed in an impeccable suit. His dark eyes were sharp, calculating. Khalid's expression darkened. His jaw tightened as he slowly placed his fork down. Zahir. Fatima glanced between them. There was tension, thick, unspoken. Zahir's gaze flicked to her, curiosity flashing in his eyes. And who's this? Before she could answer, Khalid's voice was ice. That's none of your concern. Zahir chuckled, clearly entertained. Relax, brother. I'm just surprised. You never bring anyone here. Brother? Fatima's stomach dropped. This man wasn't just anyone. He was Khalid's brother. And from the way Khalid's hands clenched, she could tell. This wasn't a happy reunion. Fatima could feel the tension in the air. The easy conversation she had been having with Khalid vanished the moment his brother arrived. Khalid's jaw was tight, his fingers curled into a loose fist on the table. He wasn't just annoyed, he was holding something back. Zahir smirked, clearly enjoying the discomfort he was causing. I didn't expect to find you here, Khalid. he said, glancing at Fatima. And certainly not in such interesting company. Fatima suddenly felt exposed, like she was an intruder in a conversation she didn't belong in. I don't owe you an explanation, Khalid said coldly. Zahir chuckled. Of course not. But you know how our father feels about surprises. The moment he said that, Khalid's expression darkened even more. Fatima frowned. Is everything okay? She asked cautiously. Khalid's gaze flicked to her, softening for a brief moment before he turned back to his brother. If you came here just to talk in riddles, Zahir, I'm not interested. Zahir raised his hands in mock surrender. Relax, little brother. I just wanted to see what could possibly distract the great Khalid al-Rashid from his duties. Fatima didn't like the way he said that, like she was the distraction, like she was nothing more than an amusement for Khalid. Khalid's fingers tapped against the table, a sign of impatience. I handle my responsibilities just fine. Zahir's smirk never faded. Our father disagrees. A heavy silence followed. Fatima wasn't sure what was happening, but she could sense that this wasn't just about family drama. Khalid's expression was unreadable, but his grip on his fork had tightened. Finally, Zahir sighed. Well, I should be going, but I'll tell father that I saw you, and that you seemed preoccupied. With that, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the sea of wealthy diners. Khalid exhaled sharply, rubbing his temple. Fatima hesitated before speaking. Was that your older brother? Khalid nodded slowly. Zahir is the heir to my family's empire, the one my father chose to carry on the business. And you? She asked carefully. He gave a humorless chuckle. I was supposed to stay in the shadows, to obey, to build what they wanted, but I made my own way instead. Fatima watched him closely. There was pain hidden behind his carefully controlled expression. But they're still watching you, she said softly. Khalid's eyes met hers, and for a moment she saw the weight he carried. My father doesn't like things he can't control, he admitted. And he especially doesn't like when I do things my own way. Fatima thought about Zahir's words. So he wouldn't approve of you being here? With me? Khalid leaned back in his chair, his lips pressing into a thin line. He wouldn't approve of me breathing without his permission. Fatima felt a strange pang in her chest. She had assumed men like Khalid, powerful, wealthy, untouchable, had no real struggles, that their lives were perfect. But now she saw the truth. Money didn't mean freedom, and Khalid, despite his power, was still fighting for his own path. She took a deep breath. Do you regret it? Not following what your father wanted? Khalid's gaze stayed on her, thoughtful. Every day. But I'd regret it even more if I had stayed under his control. Fatima nodded, understanding more than she expected to. She too had spent her whole life being told who she should be, what she should accept, what she should settle for. And yet, here she was, sitting across from a man she never should have met, in a place she never should have been, making choices she never would have dared to before. Maybe they weren't so different after all. Just as she was about to speak, Khalid's phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at the screen, and immediately his expression changed, a look of pure frustration. What is it? Fatima asked. Khalid hesitated before answering. My father wants to see me. Her stomach twisted. Because of Zahir? He nodded. My brother loves stirring trouble." Fatima didn't know what to say. Was this where the night ended? Was this where she ended? Just a strange, accidental meeting in a restaurant? But then, something happened. Khalid exhaled, then looked at her like he was making a decision. "Come with me," he said. Fatima blinked. "What?" He leaned forward, his gaze locked onto hers. "Come with me to meet him." Her heart skipped a beat. "Khalid, He cut her off. "You're honest. You don't care about money or power. That's exactly why I want you there." Fatima stared at him, unsure of what to say. This was insane. She was a nobody. What was she supposed to do in a room with one of the most powerful men in the Middle East? But then she saw it again, the weight in Khalid's eyes. He wasn't just inviting her, he was asking for her help. And that was the moment she realized. This wasn't just his battle anymore. It was theirs. Fatima's heart pounded as she sat in the back seat of Khalid's sleek black Rolls-Royce. The city lights blurred past the tinted windows, and with each mile, the weight of her decision settled deeper in her chest. She was on her way to meet Sheikh Hassan al-Rashid, the man who ruled over one of the most powerful business empires in the Middle East, and she had no idea why she had agreed. Khalid sat beside her, his face unreadable as he scrolled through his phone. He had barely spoken since they left the restaurant, but his tense grip on his knee told her everything she needed to know. He wasn't just bringing her to meet his father, he was bringing her into a war. Fatima exhaled slowly. "Khalid, are you sure this is a good idea?" He finally looked at her, his expression softer than she expected. "I don't know," he admitted, "but for the first time in years, I don't want to walk into that house alone." Something in her chest tightened. Before she could respond, the car slowed, turning onto a long private driveway lined with towering palm trees. At the end stood a mansion so vast it looked like a palace, its golden lights illuminating the night like a beacon. Fatima swallowed hard. What was she walking into? The driver stopped in front of the grand entrance, and two men in dark suits immediately opened their doors. Khalid stepped out first, straightening his jacket as his expression hardened. Fatima hesitated, gripping the door handle. This was her last chance to turn back. Then, Khalid turned and offered his hand. She looked at him, the man who, just hours ago, had been a complete stranger. Now, he was trusting her with something deeply personal. With a steadying breath, she took his hand and stepped out of the car. The entrance hall was grand, its marble floors gleaming under the soft glow of chandeliers. Every inch of the mansion screamed wealth, history, dominance. Fatima could feel the weight of generations pressing down on her. Before she could take it all in, a deep voice echoed through the hall. "You brought a guest." She turned toward the voice and felt her breath catch. At the top of the staircase stood Sheikh Hassan al-Rashid. He was tall, his presence commanding, dressed in a pristine white thobe, with a golden bisht draped over his shoulders. His salt and pepper beard was neatly trimmed, and his dark eyes held an intensity that made Fatima instinctively straighten her posture. This was not a man who tolerated weakness. Khalid's grip on her hand tightened before he let go and stepped forward. "Father." The sheikh descended the stairs slowly, his gaze assessing Fatima before he even acknowledged his son. When he finally reached them, he clasped his hands behind his back. "You are not known for bringing company," he said, his voice deep and deliberate. Khalid's jaw tensed. Things change. The Sheikh's gaze flicked to Fatima again, this time with a trace of amusement. "And who might you be?" he asked, though there was no warmth in his tone. Fatima's mouth felt dry, but she lifted her chin slightly. If she was going to be here, she wouldn't cower. "My name is Fatima," she said firmly. A single eyebrow lifted. "Fatima." He let the name hang in the air, as if expecting more. She hesitated. He wanted her last name. But would it even matter to a man like him? "I run a small bookstore," she added instead. For a split second, silence filled the room. Then, a sharp laugh. Fatima's stomach dropped. Sheikh Hassan chuckled, shaking his head. "A bookstore?" He turned to Khalid, his amusement cruel. "My son, the billionaire, who walks among kings and sultans, is now entertaining bookstore clerks?" Fatima's cheeks burned. Khalid's expression darkened. "Careful, father." The Sheikh's smile faded. For a moment, the two men stared at each other, an unspoken battle raging between them. Then the Sheikh turned and began walking toward a large wooden door at the end of the hall. "Come," he said without looking back. "Let's discuss why you're really here." Khalid hesitated before following. Fatima wasn't sure if she should move, but then he glanced over his shoulder. "Stay close," he murmured. She did. The study was dark and elegant, lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with old, leather-bound volumes. A massive wooden desk sat at the center, and behind it, the Sheikh lowered himself into a chair, steepling his fingers. Khalid remained standing. So did Fatima. The tension was suffocating. Finally, the Sheikh exhaled. "You should not have come, Khalid." Khalid crossed his arms. "You summoned me." "Yes, to remind you of your duty." His gaze flicked to Fatima. "Not to entertain distractions." Fatima clenched her fists. Khalid's jaw tightened. "She is not a distraction." The Sheikh studied him carefully. "Then tell me, son, what is she?" Silence. Fatima felt Khalid tense beside her. The Sheikh sighed and leaned back. "I'll make this simple. Return to Dubai. Fulfill your obligations. And in return, I will let you keep your independence." Fatima frowned. What did that mean? Khalid's expression remained blank. "And if I don't?" The Sheikh smiled, but there was no kindness in it. "Then I will take everything from you." Fatima's breath hitched. Khalid didn't flinch, but she saw it, the way his fingers curled slightly, the only sign that his father's words had hit their mark. Sheikh Hassan tilted his head. "Choose wisely, son." And just like that, the meeting was over. Khalid turned sharply, walking toward the door, his shoulders tense. Fatima hesitated before following. She could feel the Sheikh's gaze on her as she left, as if he was memorizing her. And for the first time since she stepped into this world, she felt truly afraid. The heavy wooden doors shut behind them, sealing Sheikh Hassan inside his grand study. The echo of the latch clicking into place sent a chill down Fatima's spine. The moment they stepped out of the room, it felt as though they had entered a different world, one where silence reigned, but tension clung to the air like a storm waiting to break. Khalid strode ahead, his posture rigid, his fists clenched. His face was an unreadable mask, but Fatima could feel the anger radiating off him. She hurried to keep up, her voice hesitant. "Khalid." "We're leaving," he cut her off. She swallowed, unsure if she should press further, but something about the way he moved, stiff, controlled, as if barely holding himself together, made her stop in her tracks. "You don't have to pretend with me," she said softly. Khalid halted mid-step. His back was still to her, but his shoulders tensed as if he was fighting some internal battle. Slowly, he turned. "I knew he would do this," he said, his voice low, measured. But hearing him say it, hearing him threaten to take everything I built, his jaw tightened. I shouldn't be surprised. Yet I am. Fatima could see it now, the weight of his father's words pressing down on him. The quiet, suffocating pressure of expectations, of control, of power disguised as love. She took a small step forward. "Khalid, what will you do?" For a moment, he didn't answer. His gaze flickered to her, and in that second, she saw something rare in his eyes: vulnerability. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I won't be controlled." Fatima nodded, understanding. She too had spent her life trying to break free from invisible chains. The difference was, her chains were made of circumstance. His were made of gold. A voice interrupted them. "I wouldn't be so sure about that." They both turned sharply to see Zahir leaning against the marble column near the staircase. His smirk was faint, but ever present, his gaze calculating. Khalid's expression darkened. "Did you come to gloat?" Zahir took a slow step forward, his hands resting casually in his pockets. "I came to warn you," he said smoothly. "You think you're free, little brother? You think walking away is as simple as turning your back? Our father doesn't lose, and when he does, he destroys." Fatima's stomach twisted at his words. Khalid remained unmoved. "Let him try." Zahir sighed dramatically, shaking his head. "I admire your stubbornness. Truly I do. But you forget how this game is played." His eyes flicked toward Fatima, and the smirk deepened. "And now, you've brought someone else into it. How reckless." Fatima stiffened under his gaze. Khalid immediately stepped in front of her, his stance protective. "Stay out of this, Zahir." Zahir raised his hands. "Of course. But let me leave you with a thought." He took a slow step closer. "You may think you're untouchable, but what about her?" The threat was unspoken, but it hung thick in the air. Fatima's blood ran cold. Khalid took a sharp step forward, his voice dangerously low. "If you ever come near her—" Zahir chuckled, unfazed. "Relax, brother. I have no interest in your guest." His smirk widened. "But father does." Fatima felt Khalid's body tense beside her. Zahir tilted his head, as if studying the cracks in his brother's armor. "You think he let her walk into this house without considering how he could use her?" Fatima's breath caught. Khalid's fists clenched, and for a second she thought he might actually hit his brother, but instead, he exhaled sharply and grabbed Fatima's hand. "We're done here." Without another word, he pulled her toward the exit. The moment they stepped outside, the night air hit them like a wave, cool, sharp, real. Khalid didn't stop until they reached the car. He yanked the door open, motioning for her to get in, but Fatima hesitated. "Khalid." His jaw was tight, his breathing controlled but heavy. "Get in the car, Fatima." She placed a gentle hand on his wrist. "Talk to me." For a moment, he didn't move. Then, slowly, he looked at her. His walls, so carefully constructed, cracked just enough for her to see the truth. He was afraid, not for himself, for her. "You shouldn't have come," he said quietly. Fatima's heart clenched. "But I did," she whispered, "and I'm not leaving." Something unreadable flickered in his gaze. Then, Without another word, he helped her into the car and shut the door behind her. As they drove away, Fatima knew one thing for certain. She was no longer just an observer in Khalid's world. She was part of the battle now, and there was no turning back. The silence in the car was thick. Fatima could feel Khalid's tension, his grip tight around the steering wheel as the city lights flickered past. "What now?" she finally asked. Khalid exhaled sharply. "Now, I make sure you're safe." Fatima frowned. "Safe from what?" He turned to her, his eyes dark with warning. "My father never loses. And now that he knows about you, he will find a way to use you against me." A chill ran down her spine. "But I'm nothing to him," she whispered. Khalid's jaw clenched. "Not anymore." She swallowed hard. The weight of his words settled over her like a suffocating blanket. She had stepped into a world she didn't understand, and now she couldn't leave. The next morning, Fatima found a small envelope slipped under her apartment door. No name, no signature, just a single card inside. "Leave him, or you will regret it." Her breath caught. She grabbed her phone and dialed Khalid's number with trembling fingers. He answered on the first ring. "What's wrong?" She could barely speak. Someone left me a note." Silence. Then, "I'm coming." 15 minutes later, his car screeched to a stop outside her building. She barely had time to open the door before he was inside, scanning the apartment, his expression dark. He picked up the note, his fingers tightening around the edges. "I should have known he'd act fast," he muttered. Fatima's heart pounded. "Khalid, what do I do?" He turned to her, his gaze burning. "You stay with me." The next night, Khalid took her somewhere unexpected. A private airstrip. A jet waited on the tarmac, the engines humming softly. Fatima turned to him, confused. "What is this?" Khalid faced her, his expression unreadable. "A way out." Her stomach twisted. "You want me to leave?" His jaw tensed. "I want you safe." She stared at him, her chest tightening. "And what about you?" He hesitated. "I'll handle my father, my brother, everything." Fatima stepped closer, forcing him to meet her eyes. "And if I stay?" His breath hitched. "Then you fight with me." The weight of his words settled between them. She had a choice. Walk away from this world, or stand beside him. She took a deep breath. Then she reached for his hand. "I stay." 2 days later, Sheikh Hassan called. Khalid put him on speaker. "I expected you to send her away," his father said, his voice cold. Khalid smirked. "You don't know me as well as you think." A pause. Then the sheikh sighed. "Very well. You made your choice." Fatima held her breath. Then his voice hardened. "Now live with it." The call ended. Fatima looked at Khalid. "What does that mean?" He smiled faintly. "It means he won't waste energy fighting me anymore." She exhaled in relief. Khalid pulled her closer, his lips near her ear. "And it means we win." She smiled. They had chosen love over power. And in the end, they won the only battle that mattered.